All right, everyone, we're going to get started. I would like to introduce you to a colleague that I work very close with at Binghamton University. When I first met her, she was a professor of art history. She's now in the Associate Dean for Faculty and Development and Inclusion role at Harper College for the Arts and Humanities. And a little unconventional for an introduction, but Nancy is a prime example of a faculty member who incorporates DH into her teaching, helps with her students. Faculty know Nancy and know that you can ask her to help in their classrooms with tools. She's always willing to help and support with research. She's been an advocate for digital scholarship and digital humanities long before my time at Binghamton. And she was also my co-organizer with the Digital Humanities Research Institute. So she's been great to work with. And take it away, Nancy.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy, for that nice introduction. And I just wanted to also thank all of you for coming to this breakout session. And I should say as well that we've been having some really great collaborations with our colleagues here at Albany. So it's lovely to be up here and to continue the conversations that we've been having, and we very much hope to continue them. So thanks to all of our colleagues here at Albany for organizing this really exciting day. So let me just say a few words. One is that I have linked to the presentation. I've kind of included the link several times because there are a few links that you might want to navigate to on your phone or your tablet or your laptop as you are here in the room, and I encourage you to do so. And I also wanted to just say a few things about where I'm starting with this very vast topic of digital publishing. So this morning we were really fortunate to hear from Rob Nelson, who is doing just unbelievable work with his projects at the University of Richmond. And I will say that most of the attention in digital humanities and digital scholarship is toward these very big public-facing projects, and for good reason. They deserve the attention, and these are the projects that often have fairly large teams of researchers and technicians, and some of them are funded by 6-7 figure grants. But I also recognize that not all of us are doing a big project like that. For me, I don't have a big project, for instance. And so today I'm really interested in speaking on a much smaller scale about those of us who are producing scholarship. Some of it might be print, some of it might be digital. We're just interested in putting our scholarly work out into the public realm through digital channels. And many of us are wondering what the best way to do that might be, and also thinking about how to reach new audiences. And so that's much more of a kind of individual, independent scholar rather than the kind of large-scale project that we heard about this morning. And so basically, I'm going to be talking about two questions to just make this kind of streamline this. First, what are the best ways to push academic content on the web? And this is a big question. I'll try to answer at least a part of it. And when I'm talking about academic content and digital content, I'm really just talking about a range of different formats and materials, digital texts, multimedia narratives, collections of digital or digitized materials, interactive maps, 3D models, data sets, all of these materials. And then the second question, which is one that we have already gotten into a little bit this morning with definitely with what we heard from my colleague Bridget Werty, is it worth it for me to do so, right? We've already understood that going digital is not easier. It's not, less time. It's not going to take less time. So why do it, right? It's got to be worth our time to do so. So I want to kind of take up these two really straightforward questions, and they're questions that I hear versions of all the time from my colleagues. They're just not sure about both of these angles, which are of course interrelated. So let me just say that my views on digital publishing, I think, really began to take shape after reading this book, which is Planned Obsolescence by Kathleen Fitzpatrick. And if you have not read this book, I really encourage you to do so. It was published in 2011, so that's 8 years ago, which in the realm of changing technologies, was really a long time ago. But I think it's still quite relevant. And what she really talks about in this text is the many challenges that are facing the academic publishing industry, right? And the kind of economic precarity popularity of academic publishing and the new kinds of pressures on academic publishing in terms of the market that it needs to reach and its changing relationship to the university. And indeed, that was what she was writing in 2011. We're still dealing with these same questions. I'm sure many of you followed the story about Stanford University Press, for instance, this summer, which was something that I think a lot of us were very interested in. So indeed, these issues have not by any means been resolved. And it was that opportunity that Fitzpatrick took to ask herself, well, if we cannot depend on the academic publishing industry and its solidity and its robustness, why are we using it as the basis on which we make so many academic decisions, right? That the academic publishing industry is like the gatekeeper for, as Bridget talked about this morning as well, not all, but many peer review functions for monographs and for articles. And she also said, well, right now we're in a moment where we've got all these new technologies. Is it the right time to think about new forms of peer review that might not be the normal double-blind peer review, but might be open peer-to-peer review, which could take place in the process of writing, could take place after writing, in which you can crowdsource comments and respond to them dynamically, rather than this kind of closed process of a kind of secret conversation between a reviewer and an editor. She also asked about how new digital formats could change the role of the author and also could allow us to think about the idea of the book in very different ways. And so this is, again, a very influential work, and I really encourage you to take a look at it. But that was, again, 2011, so things have changed since then. And she did gesture towards where we are right now. And so I'm going to put out a slightly different proposal than Fitzpatrick did. But this is going to be the premise that I'm going to be working from today, which is that academic publishing today involves a complex ecosystem of print and digital forms that each have varying relations to each other and that have varying relations to the conventional gatekeeping processes like peer review and to the traditional academic presses. And so by putting out this particular formulation, I'm very interested to hear what people in the room think about it. I hope you can see that I'm not interested at all in print-digital dichotomies. I don't think that digital is trying to kill print, and I don't think that print is trying to hold on for its dear life. I believe that in my lifetime, and there may be a lot of people in the room that are younger than I am in this room, but I'll just say in my lifetime that both of these two, print and digital, will always survive in my lifetime, and they will continue to have this dynamic relationship to each other. That's what I foresee. We can talk in a few years and see how that proposal is standing up, but that is what I envision. And I believe that we as authors do have a certain amount of control over this relationship between what kinds of publishing we want to do, and what that relationship between print and digital will be in our own scholarly profiles. We could have most scholars publish, for instance, a print book that is mirrored in some kind of EPUB or digital format that's put out by their press, right? But if I wanted to, tomorrow, I could publish my own book on a digital platform under my own name and put it out there. That would be a digital publication, right? Or I could have a digital project that might come actually under the imprint of a university press. Or I could produce my own project that is actually digital and is not peer-reviewed or reviewed by a press, and then it has a supplement in print that is put out by a journal that is issued by a press, right? So there's all these possible relationships. And I want to put this out in a way that I think is hopeful, I think it's exciting, and I think it calls upon our creativity as scholars to think about what we want that relationship to be. So I think that's exciting, and I hope that that's exciting. So let's just start with some basic kinds of questions that I think we need to kind of get out of the way before we get into this. And I'm going to kind of try to make this case through examples rather than through just talking through this. So one of the things I hear mostly from particularly emerging scholars is why? Why publish in digital formats, right? And I think this is a good question, right? I don't think we just go digital just because it's there, because everyone's doing it. We should have a rationale, right? And clearly, there are, the question is, does it serve the character of your work? And anyone who works, for instance, on time-based media, on performance, oral narratives, film, performance video, I can't imagine that you would not want to put your work out in a digital format. I'm an art historian. I work largely with still images, so that's not necessarily relevant to me, but I can't imagine, again, anyone in one of those fields not wanting to exploit and take advantage of digital formats. And although I do work, again, on these still images, and I don't necessarily need, say, video or audio in my work, I work on the international trade in the Indian Ocean in the early modern era, and so I am very interested in producing interactive maps that show the movement of people and things over time. And so those are really interesting to me and really help me to make my argument much more successfully. And so I think digital formats are really, really important and useful for that reason. Content is one thing, but audience is another. Who do you want to be reading your work? Indeed, we start intersecting with questions of public scholarship and civic engagement. Some of us are not interested in just engaging our scholarly peers. Some of us want to engage our scholarly peers, but we want our scholarly peer audience to be much wider. And so, for instance, I work on the Indian Ocean arena. This means that most of the areas of the world that I take up in my work are in East Africa, South Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, Southeast Asia, parts of the world that I know do not have very well-financed academic libraries that can afford expensive subscriptions to academic journals. And so I want to push my work out into digital formats so that it can be read by people to whom I think it is relevant. So audience matters, right? And then the other reason why you should be interested in engaging in digital formats is if you are excited about the possibilities of interaction with that audience, whoever it may be. Do you want that audience to comment on your work, to annotate your work perhaps, or to perhaps engage in those processes of open peer-to-peer review that Kathleen Fitzpatrick put out? And indeed, digital formats are precisely the way in which you can push that engagement. And if I could just take this into an example, I'm just showing you here on the screen. It's an ad for a book from the website of the University of Minnesota Press, put out by one of my colleagues. Her name is Kate Mondluck, and the book is called A Capsule Aesthetic: Feminist Materialisms in New Media Art, published last year by University of Minnesota. And this is a book about the work of 3 installation artists. Okay, and it's a print book, right? It is a conventional book. But Kate realized that she wanted to do more, and that, of course, the kind of still images in that book would not be able to capture these dynamic installations that were set up in museums around the world, and that audiences, from global audiences, interacted with in different ways. And so she decided to produce a digital supplement to this project on a platform called Scalar. And by the way, we're going to be talking, Amy mentioned Scalar already this morning. We'll talk a little bit about platforms at the end of this. So if you have questions about platforms, we will get to it in just a moment. But this digital project is actually an archive of videos of those performances that she pulled together from user-generated videos from social media. And so it's essentially an archive of those videos. And you can imagine those videos are pretty difficult to put together because they were put forward on different social media platforms, in different languages, in different countries. And so this is an amazing resource that accompanies her book. It isn't the same as her book. It is not a mirror of her book. It does something different than her book. They hinge on each other loosely. I think you can see why someone like Kate Mondluck would need to produce a digital supplement, not just because of the fact that she's relying heavily on video, but also for the fact that she's dealing with the kind of power of social media that she's trying to harness through this archival form. Social media, which I should add, is still considered to be of questionable value to art historians. And so you can really see here how she is using this particular format to help her make her argument. Again, Kate's project is a great example, again, of this dynamic relationship between presses, between digital and print, and between the conventional gatekeeping processes. And then the other question that I always hear that comes up from my colleagues is, who is responsible for producing this digital format? And I added in here the word sustaining. I don't think I'm going to be able to get into the question of sustaining digital projects because that's a huge question. We can certainly talk about it. And I think this is, to me, an open issue. For instance, there is one very well-known journal that in which there's a staff that helps you produce high-quality, multimedia-rich digital content, and it's called Vectors, and it's published by USC. This is a really amazing journal. I would take a look at it if I were you, if you haven't seen it. Unfortunately, the last issue of Vectors that came out was in the year 2013. And I've not talked to the Vectors editorial team, but I believe part of it is because it was just a really labor-intensive proposal to be working with these authors to produce this content. It was beyond the scope of what most editorial boards of most journals could do. So the way I see it, and I would love to hear from people in the audience who might have different experiences, is that if you want to be producing digital content in conjunction with your book or even an article, that you really have to take the lead on it. And then you have to go to your editorial board and say, so I was thinking, what would it be? How would you feel about a digital supplement to my book? Or what if I produced this digital archive that would be associated with my book? Or what if my whole article wasn't on your normal print platform, but was produced on a digital platform? But the issue would be that you would probably have to take the lead on that and spearhead that, and I know that's daunting for a lot of scholars. But just to kind of give you a sense again of this, I want to give you one example, and this comes from my own research portfolio. So last year, with a colleague of mine, whose name is Carrie Anderson from Middlebury College, we co-edited and guest-edited a volume of Journal 18, which is a journal of 18th century art and culture. It is a new-born digital journal that is hosted by NYU Press, and it is peer-reviewed. And it does not have a formal print output. It has print on demand, so you can generate PDFs of the articles. And the topic of this special issue was on digital mapping. And so you can imagine that I wanted to produce some really interesting content that might not be suitable for the normal WordPress platform, which is a pretty straightforward content management system, but doesn't necessarily allow us to produce, for instance, interactive maps or kind of very media-rich and multimodal scholarship. And so I went to the editorial board and I said to them, well, what do you think? Can I produce some of these articles or pieces through different platforms? And they said to me, well, we've never thought about that. And I just bring this up because this is a born digital journal. But they had never thought about, well, what about other kinds of digital content outside of WordPress? And I just think that that's really important to understand, right? That even digital journals and digital publications might not necessarily be thinking about the range of possible expressions that they could be undertaking. And they were very supportive, I will say, and they even applied for a grant from ARIA, which is the Association of Research Institutes in Art History. And sorry, everyone, most of my examples will be from art history because that's my field, but I believe much of this is relevant to other fields as well. And so they were able to bring in that money that we were able to use for web development and to hire graduate students to help produce some of that content. In the end, out of the 8 pieces that we produced, most of them were actually on the WordPress platform, but one of them was produced on Scalar, which was already mentioned, which Amy and I are demoing at Binghamton in a few weeks, and the other was produced on a platform called Choir that I will talk about in just a moment. But I just kind of present this example to let you know that if this is something that you want to pursue, I really believe that you need to just kind of push forward the issue. And some editorial teams are very receptive, others may not necessarily be, and that's really hard to say. And I think it depends on the editors, I think it depends on the press, I think it depends on on lots of issues that may go beyond the scope of your own work. Now, and I think this has been already laid out very well by my colleague Bridget Wearty this morning, but I do want to get into this because she's not here today, but I'm going to give her some of these slides later because I do have some answers for her, and I have some things to put out to the whole group. They're not perfect solutions. They are not the imaginary world that Bridget imagined and hoped for, but we're not powerless. We can change systems is what I want to say. So the question I always get, and it's funny because I always get this question from like a tenured professor in the back of the room who says, well, it doesn't count, digital scholarship doesn't count. And I say, well, who chooses what counts? You choose. Are you, why don't you try, why don't you make it count, right? And so there's, so there are responsibilities. And I just want to go into that a little bit and try to, again, be hopeful about the potential here. But while being hopeful, I also want to be realistic because indeed that's important. And I don't know if anyone saw this, came out a few weeks ago in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It was a piece that, as you can see, was called Which Publications Matter at Which Stage of Your Career. And this was a piece that, the premise of it was that, as you move through the arc of a scholarly career, that different publications, or your publication profile will change, right? And I very much agree with that, right? When the kinds of materials that you produce early on in your career may not be the kinds of things that you'll be producing at the end of your career. They will change in their tone, in their audience, in their, in the venues that they appear, and so forth, right? But one of the issues and one of the things that kind of blew up on social media about this particular article was that it was believed that the ideas about what matters were extremely conservative and backward-looking rather than forward-looking and kind of expansive, moving into the realm and the future, right? And so you can just see a few of the things I've bulleted out. The link to the article is there if you want to take a look yourself. You know, not surprisingly, it must be peer-reviewed. The publisher must have credibility. Order of authorship matters, and then I've highlighted in blue in the middle. Make sure you publish in a venue that is, you know, actually considered scholarly, right? And it's kind of taken for granted here. Blog posts, not scholarly. Op-eds, opinion pieces, not scholarly, you know, and so forth. And this author does not even consider, you know, the kind of the question of the digital, but it's clear that digital formats that I'm talking about, some of which are not monitored by those gatekeeping functions that I've just talked about, that those would be considered non-scholarly by this particular author. Well, then it's quite interesting because right below that she says, but you know, your work must be innovative. You know, so you've got to be innovative, but you can't be, you can't be doing anything that might be a little bit different. So it's a kind of, you know, there's a few contradictions in here. But I do put this up just to, you know, this was published a few weeks ago, right, in the Chronicle of Higher Education. So, you know, the publication of record for academia in many ways. And so, indeed, that kind of a very conservative view about the nature of scholarly evaluation that Bridget was lamenting this morning, indeed, is still alive and well. But, you know, so I would just respond to that author that, well, we need to change it. You know, we need to really work hard to shift what matters. And everyone has responsibilities, but I will say they are not the same responsibilities depending on who you are. That's what I think is important. And I usually do not like to kind of break up my room like, oh, you know, junior people, tenured people, librarians, administrators, and so forth. But in this case, I think it actually is necessary to kind of give a sense of, you know, what we can do. So let me just walk through this. So for, you know, emerging and junior scholars, and again, I'll send this to my colleague. We're driving home together, so I'll let her know about what I think she can do. Again, I think you should seek out digital venues if they are fitting for your work, because indeed you may be asked to provide a rationale for why you published in one venue rather than another. So you have to be ready with that rationale, okay? And I've already, in my first slide, provided some potential rationales that someone could use. And I would say, again, this is not like, you know, this is not Bridget's imaginary world, but I would say, yes, look for a peer-reviewed online journal or digital, you know, a digital venue. And the great thing is at this moment, there are so many exciting new venues that are opening up that are really allowing for inventive scholarship that are both digital and peer-reviewed. That wasn't the case 5 years or 10 years ago, but it is the case now. So I think that this is not as hard of a kind of, you know, a directive as it may have been. And I'm kind of pushing this through this whole discussion. If, say, you decide, you know, I'm going to go with a stodgy journal that no one reads, but is very, you know, has the imprint of respectability in my field to publish my article, that's great. But then, you know, why don't you publish a small digital supplement to that piece as a gateway piece, you know, to kind of keep open that possibility. Or perhaps you know, just host your images, you know, or your videos on a, you know, in a small digital publication that is associated with that publication. There are ways to try to kind of, you know, do both, I will say. And again, I know, you know, I know people are pressured, people don't have time, but, you know, you can still meet some of your goals, I would say, you know, by doing it in ways that satisfy, you know, those needs as well as some of your you know, your own desires and impulses. And I would say as well that, you know, and again, I know I'm putting a lot on the candidates, but you do need to help colleagues to evaluate your work. A lot of them, they don't know. They don't know. If they hear of a new journal they've never heard of, and they say, what is this? And so I mean very specifically, you should provide them with a list of the editorial board. Maybe there'll be someone they know. They say, oh, well, if that person's on it, this might be okay. Whatever the heck this thing is, right? Maybe, you know, provide a list of grants that journal has received. There's a lot of grants that have been given to new digital publications. That helps to again give an imprint of you know, of the value to convey the value. Give them tables of contents of earlier, you know, of other issues of that journal, especially if they feature people and other scholars whom they may know. And you know, again, I know this might seem excessive, but I think this does help for those who truly do not have a foot in this field and do not understand it. So that's what I would say. Okay. okay? And then now, I'm sure someone's gonna bite my head off about this, because whenever I say the word analytics in an academic situation, someone wants to like it, someone gets really mad at me. But I'm gonna say, if you need to use analytics and if it helps your case, definitely use them. Administrators love analytics, they love dashboards, and and again, if it, I think that if you can show that you have a digital, an article in a digital journal, or even a blog post that got 800 page views, ask your committee, you really want to tell me that this peer-reviewed article that's been only downloaded 4 times on Project Muse is more important than that blog post? Put that out there, right? I think it's a really interesting discussion to have. I don't know how it'll turn out, but I think the discussion needs to be had. And as was already discussed with Rubika Risab this morning as well, do connect your personnel committees and people who need to see these resources. Indeed, every scholarly society has these resources. And I know people don't read them. Maybe you have to print them out, okay, which is funny, first of all, and highlight the sections that are relevant. But, I think that helps. So I'm just putting this out there as things that, people who feel, again, relatively disempowered in the system, what you can do, and I think that's important. For more established people, I will say it's a whole different set of responsibilities. Okay, so it's for these established people who have tenure, who have stability, who should be publishing in these really cutting-edge venues to help these venues establish their reputations, right, and to take risks with their publishing, because that's the only way this happens, right? And also, when someone asks you to review a digital project, either as a peer review, like a blind peer review, or to review it post-publication to be published, say yes. Okay, and this is, for me, I'll usually say, oh no, I can't do that, I can't do that. But when it comes to digital work, I will say yes, because I want it to be reviewed, I want it to appear, I want it to be out in the world, and I also know that I can give it a sympathetic reading that understands its goals. I've seen lots of reviews and responses to digital work that is very unsympathetic because the reader or the reviewer was just not in line with the goals of this kind of work. And so I think people who are sympathetic to the work should give it a fair hearing, is what I'm saying. If you have an editorial role, there's so many possibilities. You can compel your teams to begin to be more serious about considering and publishing digital work and reviewing it. There are also grants out there too to support this kind of development, as I already indicated with my discussion of the ARIA grant. And I will say as well, so I was a reviews editor for a journal in my field a few years ago. And the first thing I did is I told them we need to start reviewing digital scholarship, like in our book review section. And there was a lot of pushback. It took several months for that to be approved, but it finally was. We were able to publish a series of reviews of digital projects. And I can't say that those reviews of digital projects changed the world, but I do know that they were brought up in personnel committees where someone would say, well, what is this thing? And someone would say, oh, that was just reviewed in the ARC Bulletin. And so there was an impact. And I would say these are incremental stages, but I think they're important. And then I would say that those of us who are tenured and established need to change tenure standards in our units, and that's where it needs to start. And I will say that it seems really daunting, but sometimes it's just a matter of language. Like, for instance, I have colleagues who will literally kick and scream and say, there is no way that a blog can be submitted for tenure. That is absolutely ridiculous, all right? And that same person, if I say, well, how would you feel about adding language in the tenure guidelines? It said something like, scholarly publications that reach a large audience but do not take a traditional format may be submitted as part of a tenure dossier. And they're like, all right. And so that's the way that you open the door, right? And so sometimes it's about language. It's not necessarily, and one's got to kind of intervene in systems in ways that are legible to those who participate in those systems. Okay, and librarians and Amy and others can help me in this. I would just ask librarians to help faculty to understand the range of options that are available to them, and I would even ask you to ideally sketch these really dynamic print-digital relations rather than some, again, print-digital war dichotomy, which I think is really not very helpful at all. I would also ask librarians while you're doing this to be frank about the challenges. I think it's really important. Amy and I just did a session a few weeks ago, basic session, WordPress, helping some colleagues build their sites on WordPress, and I forget how hard it can be sometimes, right? And after that session, I was like, oh, now I remember how hard it can be. Our colleagues at CUNY at the DHRI, they told us, never use the word easy. It's actually demoralizing for people. So I replaced it with low barrier of entry or something like that, which still, still meant the same thing. But indeed, being frank about challenges, I think, is really important, because I think it's misleading not to be frank about those challenges. And indeed, again, notwithstanding what we heard this morning and understanding that, what Rupika Risa was talking about in terms of labor and ethical collaboration, please collaborate with colleagues. You are indeed, as Rupika said, I know there are a lot of librarians in the room, so I'm addressing you in the audience, are really really the lifeblood of these projects. And so those collaborations, I know that there would be no possibility for them without the collaboration and the intellectual work of librarians. And indeed, Amy and I have been working together really closely for the past few years, and I don't think we would have been able to do any of it, entirely on our own. So. Oh, okay, and then I have one more set of responsibilities, and so you may have gathered, I've been an associate dean for less than 2 months, so this is not what I've done, this is my to-do list, okay? So you can check back in with me in about, a year, give me a year, and I'll let you know how it goes. I think administrators have the potential to really recognize the value of digital work through, those conventional channels of recognition, through awards, through identifying work that's been done by scholars and making sure that digital work is part of that, right? That's part of this kind of cycle of acceptance, right? And I would also, part of my brief is to work with these units to help them understand that tenure standards need to reflect the changing landscape of the field. And so that's something that I'm going to be working on, and I will send you some notes from the field on that and let you know how that goes. And I think that the colleagues in digital humanities are all in agreement that this wording about digital work should ideally be going in offer letters, like all the way to the beta. You can't wait until the end, 6 years into a tenure clock, like, oh, by the way, does this count? Or is this okay? I mean, you need to know when you're hired, right? And this is, I think, yet to happen in a lot of scenarios, but the hope is that that is what will be the next phase. Okay, so that's just a few things about the academic standards. Now I just want to say a few words about platforms. And when I was talking to Deborah about planning the session, I wasn't sure if we were actually going to do like a hands-on workshop. Amy and I usually like to have every single person with a laptop in front of them working, and doing something active. That's not the way the session turned out, but I do want to say something about platforms, because I know there's always a lot of questions about this. So what I've done here on the screen is I have excerpted 3 platforms that I would suggest that you take a look at if you are interested in publishing your work in a digital format. I want to be really clear. These are not featured because they are the only ones. They are certainly not the only ones, or because they are the best ones. They are up here because I'm familiar with them, because I have used almost all of them, and because I think they all work really differently, so they really help you to understand the kinds of considerations to take into account when you're thinking about which platform to choose. And I also want to be very clear here, after Rob Nelson spoke this morning, the first question that came up was, how do I learn how to do this, right? And Rob gave this answer that said, there are some out-of-the-box platforms that you can use to do this kind of mapping that will get you so far, and then if you want to produce these kinds of large-scale projects like the kind I'm doing, you're probably going to need to work with some developers. He even worked with a commercial firm, right? So these are the out-of-the-box platforms that I believe almost anyone can get started with on their own with probably minimal technical assistance. And they are all developed by either universities or nonprofit institutions. They are Scalar, Manifold, and Choir. And again, to everyone, if there's the link to this presentation on the bottom of the page if you want to take a look at any of these. And this will be available to you after this session as well. So I encourage you to go in and you can kind of look through some of these projects if you're interested. So let's talk about Scalar, which you've already heard is one that I've used. Amy and I have worked very extensively with faculty, and we've used it in the classroom as well. We advocate for it because it is a platform that anyone can get started on immediately. It's browser-based, and it has a low barrier of entry. I will say it again, you can take from that what you would like. It is an authoring and publishing platform that allows the reader to produce a narrative through which to someone to produce a narrative through which the reader can take multiple paths through. And it also allows for a dynamic integration of media, which includes all kinds of images, moving image, audio. There's also capacity to work with 3D models, and they're working on VR plugins, by the way. So VR, AR plugins with Scalar as well. So there's a lot of potential. And just as one sample project, and again to kind of go back to that relationship, this dynamic relationship, I'm featuring Sam Liebhauer's project, which was developed by our colleague Alicia Peaker when she was working with him at Middlebury College. And this is a project called When Melodies Gather, Oral Art of the Mahra, and it's dealing with an oral poetry tradition in the Arabian Peninsula, which is an endangered tradition. And Sam's whole idea with this was, why should I write a book about a poetry tradition that has never been written down and was never meant to be written down? And so he decided to use Scalar so that he could feature the poetry in its original form, which was in audio. And it's a really interesting project. He has this kind of choose your own adventure kind of path through some of these audio clips. And it is developed on Scalar, but it was customized for his purposes. And I hope you can see here too that this was actually published under the imprint of Stanford University Press in their digital project series. And just to be clear here again about that dynamic relationship, not all Stanford University Press books are Scalar books, or digital projects are Scalar books. Not all Scalar books are SUP books. But indeed, this is one case in which Stanford decided to work with Scalar for this particular project. So, again, I could publish a book on Scalar tomorrow without anyone's permission except for my own, right? Or you could work under the auspices of a press, as Sam has done here, which is, gives you a sense of these possibilities. And one thing I'll tell you about Scalar is once you put it in there, you can't get it out. There's no PDF output, which is, makes sense because most of the media is quite dynamic and there's all these paths you can take through it. That's very important for some people. Some people really want to make sure that there's an output that is commensurate in print, but there is none for Scalar. Okay, let me talk about Manifold, which is a collaborative open source platform for network scholarly publishing that is developed by the CUNY Graduate Center and the University of Minnesota Press. So yet again, another collaboration, but one that is not exclusive. So you can produce a Manifold book that is not a University of Minnesota book. You can produce a University of Minnesota book that is not a Manifold book, okay? So there's these kind of complex relationships, and if you have questions about that, I can dig deeper into this when we turn to questions. And so authors can produce texts and projects that can be then updated, annotated, and commented upon. And I want you to understand that what's really useful about Manifold is it allows for this great deal of interaction with the text. It's really, there's a vision for it that is very much related to open educational resources. And so that's one of the main kind of interests of the group that developed it. And just to give you a sense of that, for instance, the Manifold book that we're looking at here, or the Manifold project that we're looking at here on the screen, is a version of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So some of you might say, well, why bother making another version of Huckleberry Finn? It is precisely because our colleagues at CUNY wanted to use this in the classroom and then have their students annotate and speak to each other and comment and work around the text as a classroom book, which they couldn't necessarily do with the print versions, or even, let's say, a Google Books version or another digital version. And so you can see here what the potential is. And just so you understand, with Manifold, it is browser-based, but it's not like Scalar. Like Scalar, I could give you you can gain the login key quite easily. I have it if anyone wants it, by the way. And you could start a book, again, immediately. With Manifold, it needs to be installed either at your institution, or you can work through the CUNY instance of Manifold. So there's two different ways to do it, but it's got a little bit of a different kind of structure than Scalar does. Indeed, if you're interested in looking at the Minnesota Press's books that were produced on Manifold, I encourage you to take a look at that list through the link. And now just to say a few words about Quire. Quire is a digital publishing framework that's developed by the J. Paul Getty Trust, and which oversees the Getty Museums. And so this framework was produced really as a vehicle to publish their very image-rich exhibition catalogs. But it is also open to anyone who wishes to use it, although it is currently in its beta version. You can get permission to produce while it's in this development stage. The project that you can see on the left, which was part of that journal that I mentioned, we used it still when it was in the testing stage. And Quire works totally differently than scalar or manifold. It uses plain text files to produce static websites. So that simply means that you produce a file of, a folder of files that are formatted to the required specifications using their plain text files, and you put these up on your server and it generates the website. So that means if you want to make a change to your website, you have to change the files. Okay, you're not working through a browser like you would for through Scalar, for instance, or most of the web applications that content management systems that many of you may be familiar with. Quire is a little higher barrier of entry or threshold of entry in that you need to use a command line interface, to work with it, and it requires familiarity with Markdown, for instance, which is the lightweight markup language, and so there's just a little bit more, a few challenges in getting started with Quire. But what's really cool about it is it's got a dynamic IIIF viewer built into it, so you can really do a lot with images in Quire. And it has a very sleek and easy way to generate PDFs and EPUBs directly from the site. And if you'd like to look at the project that I helped produce for that Journal 18 volume, you can follow the link that is on the screen. And the last thing I will say is that those 3 platforms, again, are just 3 platforms. And so I encourage you to take a look at this terrific resource here on the screen, which was just published by MIT Press, that is actually an inventory of all current open source platforms for digital publishing. And you're going to find, I don't know how many they have, many more than the ones I listed, but they also include the ones that I've included in my presentation. And that will give you a sense of the range of possibilities of digital publishing, and I encourage you to take a look at it. So I think that's all I have to say, and I just wanted to open it up to any questions or provocations or responses to some of the ideas that I brought up. Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much for the presentation. Several of us here are from a university press, and I think there's a lot of...
I want to meet you and talk to you then.
Yes.
And I also want to hear what if you reject anything that I put out here, because I'm very curious from the press point of view.
Well, there's a lot of discussion in the university press community and getting involved in these digital scholarship projects.
Yes.
But as you alluded to, we're facing a strain of declining university funding and state funding, and increasingly sales of our books and articles are expected to, this is what our budget comes from.
Yes.
So given that, what would you say that publishers, if publishers is one of your categories of what can we do to support and to get involved?
Yeah, and you're right that publishers should have been one of the categories, and I'm sorry that I neglected to include you there, and I'm very happy to see you. Are you for SUNY Press?
That's right.
Okay, fantastic. So I would say that, I think there used to be some logic about this kind of competition, that if you have a digital version of your work out there, it is going to then suck up all the interest and no one's going to buy your books, right? And I think that we found that that's really not the case. That digital presence increases interest and awareness of your work and drives people then to seek out more of your work or to seek out print versions of your work, right? So I think that's important. Again, that relationship is one that is helpful, not hurtful necessarily, right? And I would say that. So there are now, I just brought up a few examples, but several university presses now are partnering with institutions to work on platforms that are tailored for their own books, right? And I don't know if SUNY has any of those kind of aspirations in the future. But I would just say to encourage authors to think about what kinds of possibilities they can explore. And again, I think this, thinking about this dynamic relationship, right? I think everyone should have a website for their book that they manage. I actually don't think that's the press's responsibility. Just like I think that the author wants to have control over that website rather than the press having control of it necessarily. The author may want to update that website, and as they come to new findings, have that be an evolving site where you can go back and address things that you might have gotten wrong in your book, right? And so there's just such an amazing possibility to think about this generative relationship between print and digital. And so I would just encourage your authors to consider that. And again, I think that when I, put up that slide of like whose responsibility is, I think that particularly those who have not yet waded into the world of digital publishing and are not necessarily initiated into it, they just don't even know that they should ask. I mean, there's, they kind of wonder, like, is someone going to just come up to me and tell me, oh, do you want to do this digital, digital book or digital supplement? And that's not what I've seen happen. So I think encouraging authors to take that risk, and it is a risk to a certain extent, but take that step rather, and then I think that it kind of opens up all these doors in terms of publicizing their work, but also creating a continuing conversation of scholarship. I mean, the book is never the end. Right? And there's something liberating about the notion that, I can publish that book and I can keep talking about it for the next 20 years if I want to. And I think that's the way scholarship should be. It shouldn't be a closed door. So I hope that's useful. But yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk, and I really appreciate your enthusiasm about digital publishing. I'm curious to hear your thoughts and maybe some examples that you've experienced in the past about the potential for digital publishing in terms of promoting interdisciplinary work as well as public intellectual work, including activism as well.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I didn't talk about about public scholarship and civic engagement very much at all. I feel like that's kind of that I think Dave Hochfelder is doing a session on public history, for instance, and engagement. And I have to say. There are so many amazing figures out there right now who are, engaging in using social media, for instance, as academic platforms, and so many venues that I think allow us to have like different levels of engagement with different kinds of communities that are both academic and non-academic, right? And so I think it's a really, really exciting moment. Being very visible is also dangerous, I would say as well, right? And I think that's one thing I've also heard is that a lot of people putting themselves out there have also been, have received some very negative comments. My husband, he put out a piece a few months ago, and he was getting death threats, it's very scary, right? It's scary to put yourself out there, right? So it's a complicated proposal, but I would say, I don't think we have a choice anymore to say, okay, I'm just withdrawing from this kind of public realm, and I think it was possible. Definitely 10 years ago, and I think most scholars fell into that category. But our work is out there, right? And so I think we are already engaged. So I think what the message that we have to take control of how we are then channeling our work, making sure that the people who need to read it are reading it, and also trying to. This is more difficult and more complicated, but to make sure that our work is not misinterpreted and used for purposes to which, it's not just that we don't want it to be used, but, for reasons that, for agendas that we find to be extremely malicious, right? Because that also happens as well. So, so there's a lot of angles to it, but I don't know if that's a full enough answer to your question, but again, that's exactly the direction I think we need to be moving. And again, even for those who don't wish to be part of that, I guess my answer to them is you already are, right? And even, and so this is in some ways the university presses, people are like, I don't want, all of our work it's available, any book that we publish, it's, all of this material, it is circulating, right? And so having more of a presence and ability to, to make sure that that work is doing what you really want it to do, I think is really important. So, intervening in that, I think, and gaining that, again, control of, who we are academically and who we are as scholars.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Jennifer from SUNY New Paltz. I actually want to ask you guys a question.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you're getting requests from scholars to submit supplemental materials.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. I'm very curious as well.
Yeah, so it has come up. I had a project on Hebrew theater in the early to mid 20th century, and this was based on archive, like recordings of plays.
Yes.
And so the author was asking, do you have a platform for having these recordings online so people who read the book, which is analyzing them, can listen to them? And unfortunately, we don't have the resources on our site to host that and develop it. But just like you were saying, I told the author, you're welcome to put that up on your website and we can link to it. And and you can even include a pointer in the book to invite people to look there. So that's where we're at right now, and it has come up.
Did he do it?
The
author.
The book is still.
You're still in process, or she?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that was.
But and I think what would be great is to say, you could do it. Take a look at this resource, which gives you, this book that I have up here on the screen, which gives you a whole inventory of possible platforms that you could use to begin to explore producing your own website, right? Because that's in the next step. Because I have people come to me, they say, "Oh yeah, the press told me that I have to make a website. How do I do that?" So that, and some people, again, it might be very easy for them, and that might be quite natural. But others then feel very lost when the press sends them out. Right?
Yeah, definitely there's a role for serving as a resource to authors.
Yes.
Pointing them in the right direction.
Yeah, so this is I think a great resource because it just lists every single open source platform that they could look, that's active right now. So
I also would want to add, so I work in the library, that the digital repository that a lot of the libraries are managing is a space where these types of materials can be deposited and maintained in perpetuity.
Of course, yes.
For as long as the digital repository keeps going, but like that, it makes me feel a little uneasy, like, oh, if this stuff's being published on the publisher's website, how am I cataloging that and like getting it to the scholars on campus? Like, how are they going to discover that if it's just on the University Press website, and if it's just on their personal website? Same thing, like how does that go through our discovery systems and get out there to students and faculty on campus? And maybe, I'm sure this is being discussed in other places, but even just at lunch, I was talking with Bridget, and we were talking about our own scholarship, our non-scholarly publications, but presentations and this and that and the other things that we are depositing into our digital repositories. And that's really well.
Yeah, no, I think that, I think that's really, really, really important. I mean, I will say, in an age when academics move around a lot more than they used to, I just, for something like a book, I think I would probably want to have control of the site myself, so that just as a personal, personally, you can get a DOI for a website though. Right, and so I mean there are ways to begin to.
How does it get to the library? That's my question.
I think we have some librarians in the room, other librarians in the room as well. Yeah, that I don't know about, but this question of also cataloging digital projects, finding them, it is definitely a huge issue. But that doesn't mean we should stop producing them, right? It's something we're going to, that we're still reckoning with that question.
Oh, right. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying we shouldn't.
Hey Nancy, and Clay from SUNY Albany. So thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I really learned a lot, especially the tips that you gave out for emerging scholars and graduate students who would want to publish using digital platforms. So as an emerging scholar and a graduate student, I would like to know if you can give out some tips on how to convince established scholars to collaborate with us in publishing journals and digital platforms, because I had experiences before when I approached professors and established scholars, and they said, I don't believe in the concept of digital humanities, and what is that in the first place? And I'm like, it's so disempowering sometimes, because you have the urge to really publish, but then again, you're disempowered because those collaborators do not believe in the platforms that you're trying to promote.
Yeah, it's, I will say, one thing that I think is important, and Amy will agree with this, with me, that definitely graduate students, I will say, have a huge pivotal role in bringing digital humanities acceptance to scholars. Like what I've seen is that I can sit there and go on and on, talk to a colleague of mine and tell that person why they need to begin to become more digitally aware, and they're just like, please stop talking, I'm really sick of hearing this from you, for the past how many years. But when they actually see their own graduate student in a dissertation suddenly come up with something, work that they've been supervising, that is actually where I've seen the transformation. That so many kind of established people will tell me, oh yeah, my student, like I don't even know how they did this math thing, and that is when so you do actually. Emerging scholars, and particularly doctoral students, do have an amazing amount of impact there, I have to say, which is really important to understand, because I know that it's easy to feel disempowered, right? So that's really important. I would say that I think it really depends on the project. I think that and again, if there's some way in which you can make an argument that what you are publishing you could not publish in another venue. Right, and so whether that, and if I go back to that first slide I showed before, whether it's about some kind of media that you cannot feature in another venue, or some kind of tool of argument. Like for me, a map is not just a picture. A map is an argument, especially an interactive map that you can then begin to interact with, and it can start to tell you something, like the ones that Rob Nelson was showing this morning, which are extremely powerful, right? And so if you could if you have that kind of material, then you may be able to, I think, make a very compelling argument. And so, because indeed, to really change opinions, sometimes you have to, have something that's just going to be kind of pivotal, and something that someone has not necessarily known was possible before.
We have time for one more question,
I don't know if it's too soon to tell from your experience, but I wondered if you had what you had come up against in terms of being able to maintain these digital creations for the long term. Of course, there's been dialogue for many years about journal publishers being responsible outside of libraries for preserving the journal content, but with people creating personal digital platforms or purely digital platforms, what are the opportunities and challenges for making sure that scholarship is managed into the future so that the scholars can continue to access the information?
Okay, well, I'm going to say something, and everyone in this room is going to hate it. I don't think everything needs to live forever. I really don't. And I'm sorry, I know I'm like talking to all these librarians and I'm a host about libraries, but I really don't think everything needs to live forever. I will tell you that indeed, some of these projects that are built on particular kinds of configurations that are going to are not going to work in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. Their death is inevitable, right? And so, I think a lot of, and again, I've already said, I watch analytics. I see how, when people go to projects, what their life cycle is. And, I don't know that all of these projects, again, need to have, to move into, to be sustained into perpetuity. And I know that's really, I know Amy's like, really? Are you really saying that, Nancy? But I very much believe that. I mean, because, for instance, and let me just, I'm an art historian. Exhibitions, if you saw it, you saw it. And I refer to exhibitions I've seen in my writing, but that exhibition is no longer there. There's a trace of it, perhaps in an exhibition catalog, or maybe not. That doesn't mean it didn't exist. It still had an impact. There might be a review of it, but, so not every output of scholarly production has to have a trace that is exactly that is its exact replica. Did that make grammatical sense? Do you see what I'm saying? And so that is what I would put out as my kind of like, just let's look at the big picture. In terms of sustaining projects, I think that MOUs have to be written up, or some kind of charter, like Rufika was talking about who manages these things. Like, for instance, for labor, I've been talking to graduate students who've been tasked with building a project, and then the group that has asked them to build a project, 5 years later will say, well, can you fix this thing? This link is broken, things like that. And that's just not, there has to be some plan moving forward, right? And so that is for sure. But again, I count that within this understanding that I know that some things that I've built, that they, and they were in many ways thought experiments for me too. Like, let's see what happens when we do this, And if there's a day when it just doesn't exist any 404 error message, I feel like that maybe that was the life cycle of the project.
I think that's an important conversation, though, that scholars need to have.
Mhm.
So I love the enthusiasm of the graduate student in the back of the room with their beautiful smile.
Yeah.
But I think that that's a really important decision that the scholar has to make for himself. And it needs to be part of the conversation.
Yeah. And also remembering too, in a very kind of networked, very networked projects, those links, they're going to be broken. You know what I'm saying? Like that is the inevitability. If we think that every single link that you produce in a project, to YouTube videos, to tweets, I mean that this is going to be, that this is going to have this longevity. It's not. So the question rather is then, what do we consider the temporality of the project to be? What is its life cycle? How long is it relevant, and so forth, right? So there's like several discussions that we could have, not all of them that are hinging upon the notion that we have to sustain everything. So, but, again. You can feel free to completely disagree.
Yeah, well, thank you so much,
Thank
Nancy,
you.
for that great talk.